Hey Euro, these are notes about the Italian Renaissance, or at least the chapter that's on the Renaissance. And so when I'm taking notes on a certain subject, on a chapter that we went over, and again, this covered basically 2.5 weeks, that we're just gonna, I'm gonna give you a basic overview, and you'll go through and you'll look at what you know and think about what you don't know, and you may have to relearn or to think about it in another context. And so with the Renaissance, we're gonna do the same thing. And so what I have with me here, that you have too, is I've got my McKay book. I've got it open to the Renaissance chapter. Then I've also got my crash course book. Sorry, mine is the last edition of it, but same thing. And I'm opening it up, period 1, into where it says Italian Renaissance, and I'm going to use that and look through that. What I like about this crash course book is if you look here, this gives you real basic overviews of what happens between 1450 and 1648. For example, the first one, the worldview of European intellectuals shifted from one based on ecclesiastical and classical authority to one based primarily on inquiry and observation of the natural world. In other words, ecclesiastical means church, classical means Greek or Roman. And so the worldview from this time, 1450 to 1648, it's going to change from one that's dominated by the church and the early Renaissance, where they're just rediscovering Greek and Roman ideas, to one that is it's the early scientific revolution on inquiry, on asking questions, logic and reason, and observation of the natural world. So that's going to be one of the major shifts that happen. Another one, the struggle for sovereignty with and among states results in varying degrees of political centralization. This basically means in some, the struggle for sovereignty or power in different states, varying degrees of political centralization. There are some states where there are wealthy merchant classes, or there are other places where nobles take power, and then there are other places where there's more centralized power, where monarchs take power. And that's in places like England, in France and Spain, are where you have these monarchs who take control. And by 1648, those become absolutist. Okay, religious pluralism challenges the concept of a unified Europe. This is basically about the Reformation. There's going to be breaks in the Catholic Church, so there will no longer be a unified Catholic Church, that was there in 1450. By 1648, remember that's the end of the 30 Years' War. That starts as a religious conflict. There are lots of different types, sects of Protestantism by that time. Also in 1492, that's when the entire other part of the world is, they realize there's a whole other part of the world. And so that changes the worldview, and these encounters with indigenous people, and also the Columbian Exchange changes the world too. And then finally, society, where experiences of everyday life are increasingly shaped by commercial and agricultural capitalism, notwithstanding the persistence of medieval social and economic structures. So even though there are medieval social and economic structures, like there is feudalism in some sections of Europe, and also there is subsistence farming. At the same time, there's also going to be cash crops, commercial and agricultural capitalism as well by the end of period 1. Anyway, sorry, that's a more overview of this period. So what this covers is the Italian Renaissance, and then it's going to go to the Northern Renaissance, and then it's going to cover the new monarchs. And so that's what this chapter covers. You can see it in McKay that it's going to cover the Renaissance in Italy, changing ideas about the Renaissance, such as humanism, and then it's going to look at art, social hierarchies. This looks at the roles of men and women in class, and then here, this is going to cover the new monarchs, the nation states that develop in England and in France and in Spain. And so let's start with the Italian Renaissance. And so Renaissance, it's roughly from 1400 to 1600, and it happens in the northern Italian city-states. The definition, Renaissance, the French word, Renascimento, the rebirth. And it's a rebirth of what? Of Greek and Roman learning and a flourishing of modern art. Not of modern art, sorry, a flourishing of art. And when you think of the Renaissance, again, these northern Italian city-states, the big one that we look at, you've got Milan and Venice and Genoa. There are the papal states, but the biggie is in Florence. And who are the people why is it happening here? It's because of wealthy merchants. That's really the cause of wealthy merchants. And remember, we looked at the rise of the merchant class, and what is causing the rise of a merchant class? These merchants are trading with the world that they knew at that time, which was Eurasia, not your Asia, but EUR Asia. They are Europe and Asia. They're trading for spices and silks, and they're bankers, and they have letters of credit. There are all these different advances in banking, and that makes them a lot of money. And what did wealthy people do when they get a lot of money? They want to show off their wealth, and they become patrons of the arts. And during this time, because you're in northern Italy, there's also the ruins of Roman civilization. And as they're trading also with Greece, they're seeing Greek civilization, and they're trading with the Muslims, and the Muslims have kept Greek and Roman learning alive too. And through that trade of ideas and of looking at the ruins around them, and with their wealth, they patronize the arts and of learning in general. And what I want you to remember, the big thing of the Renaissance is this quote, or this way to remember it. Humanism, right, is easy, EASI. This has to do with the values. Values of the Renaissance. And what is humanism? Humanism, this word is in a lot of our definitions. It's the glorification of the human body and mind. And what are some of these values of the Renaissance? Education, becoming well-educated, or a Renaissance man is the term that's used. Someone who is skilled in different aspects. We always think of Leonardo da Vinci as that example of education. Someone who is a scientist, an artist, an engineer, studying anatomy. Remember with Michelangelo, when he was looking at David, creating David, he's actually studying corpses and anatomy. And so you can see how the scientific revolution and the Renaissance are sort of going hand in hand. A stands for antiquity. Again, antiquity, or this also you can call it classical, which has to do with Rome and Greece. And they're rediscovering, so people speak Latin, right? Most everything is written in, that says Rome, sorry. The Roman Empire. Roman and Greek learning is antiquity. We see that in examples of perspective, of nude figures in the art, of Greek and Roman gods as examples in the art too. S stands for secularism. And so secular means not sacred or not religious. It means the material world. If you think of Madonna, the material girl, material world. And the material world is, rather than being solely based on the church, it is based on either Greek and Roman learning or observation, or the subject of paintings could also be the patrons themselves who are supporting the arts. I is the individual, and you can see that in the expressions of the people in Renaissance art. Go back and look at the different Renaissance art of the time. Go back to the Ninja Turtles, right, of Da Vinci, Leonardo, of Michael da Vinci, of Michelangelo, of Raphael, and even Donatello, the sculptor. And you can find it in architecture. So the arts isn't just limited to the sculptors and the painters. Architecture is Brunelleschi, his dome. That's in Florence, the Duomo. It's the first freestanding dome since Roman times. Also in letters or in writing. And so remember Castiglione, the courtier, where he writes about an ideal Renaissance person. And also we have Machiavelli, Niccolo Machiavelli, and whose ideas we see later in terms of realpolitik, in that he's not basing his advice on morality. In The Prince, his book, basically is an advice book of how to get power. And you can, if you remember some of them, it's like a prince would sometimes be a lion and sometimes a fox. And so this is not about morality. This is not typical advice that you would get from the church. It's saying, don't look at morality, look at reality, okay? The politics of reality. This is idea, or realpolitik, this idea that, you know, Bismarck is going to use later. He's not going to be a conservative. He's just going to say, how can I get ahead? What do I need to do? Is it better to be loved or feared? Well, it's good to be both, but if you have to choose to be feared. That's Machiavelli. And so there you go, Renaissance. Sorry, this video is getting too huge. It's 12 minutes in. So those are the values of the art and the writing of the Renaissance. Also look at the role of women during this time, because there are exceptions. Some patrons are women, like what's her name? Isabella d'Este. And look at that in your reading. And also remember Sofonisba Anguissola, the painter, who did the chess game with her sisters. And so while women are generally excluded, there were examples of women who were excluded from the arts and from power. You do have powerful women at this point, and educated women despite restrictions on women. And same thing with people in power. For example, some of the most powerful, one of the most powerful monarchs during this time. Think to Ferdinand and Isabella. Okay, let's see. That's basically the Italian Renaissance. Then it moves north to the Northern Renaissance. And in the Northern Renaissance, this is, instead of humanism, there's Christian humanism. And this is a precursor or a cause of the Reformation later, because the Christian humanists, they want to read the Bible in the original Greek or Aramaic and then translate it to the vernacular. So they're doing the work of humanism, but they're applying it to Christianity. So read in original Greek, the Bible, and then translate to the vernacular. They're also using the printing press to share their works. And some of the most famous ones of this time, if you remember Erasmus, who's Dutch. Erasmus laid the egg that Luther hatched. Remember that one? And then we also, let's see, who else? Sir Thomas More in his book Utopia. This is all precursors to the Reformation that are happening in the Northern Renaissance, which is basically the Low Countries, Flanders, Netherlands, and Northern Germany. That's where Nev and Northern Germany. Okay. Also, the art from the Renaissance, Northern Renaissance art that's from this area, it tends to be extremely detailed All right. The art of the Northern Renaissance. I'm trying to make this work. Northern Ren art. Think of Jan Vermeer is the example of it. And I showed you that painting of the Arnolfini wedding, which was the husband and the wife, and there was a little dog below them, and in the mirror behind them, you could even see the reflection of the artist. It was extreme detailed, and that was an example of there was a perspective there. There were layers of paint. There were the patrons were depicted, and so in individualism, it showed extreme detail there. So that's Vermeer, and there are others too. Look back at that. So we've got Renaissance, Northern Renaissance, and the other part of this chapter had to do with the new monarchs. And there are new monarchs that happen. New monarchs mean where monarchs are gaining power over the nobles. It's basically how we saw during the 100 Years' War, monarchs are gaining more power. And in some places of Europe, especially England, France, and Spain, they get even more centralized power. So centralized power. And there are examples in England of Henry VII, who we didn't look at, and there are examples of France, of Louis the Spider King, we didn't look at. The one we did look at was in Spain, and this is Ferdinand and Isabella. Ferdinand and Isabella. And like Machiavelli, they don't marry for love, they marry for power. And when we're looking at monarchs, and we're going to do this in the absolutism unit too, monarchs get power together, and they try to get power over different aspects of society. And the thing I want you to remember in terms of how they get power over society is this idea of Reina P. Raena, Reina, and then P. What are the different aspects of society that these monarchs are gaining control over? They gain control over religion, over A, the army, over E, the economy, N, nobles, A, arts and architecture, and then P, the peasants. And in Spain, with Ferdinand and Isabella, the big things for them are religion, right? They're called the Catholic monarchs. They both defeated Moors, and they also expelled the Jews from Spain. So in 1492, they send Columbus to the New World, and also they defeat the Moors, driving them from southern Spain, from Granada, and they expel the Jews with the decree of Alhambra. They kick them out of Spain. And so they only have one religion. We know this later comes to hurt them. They're expelling their bankers. They're expelling their people of learning. They're also expelling, with the Moors, people who are merchants. And so this is going to eventually, this religious intolerance is going to cause economic problems for the Spanish. But at the same time, they are with economy. This is through taxation and through nobles. They have some control over it. The nobles do have something called a cortes, or their court system. But look back at, it's in McKay, all about, and for that you wrote about how much control did Ferdinand and Isabella have. And they curbed aristocratic power by excluding high nobles from the royal council, which had full, look over, and if you can remind yourself how they dominated and what parts of Reina P did they control. All right. And anyway, the other major thing that they do is the Inquisition, which lasts all the way until the early 1800s, which is where where Ferdinand and Isabella have control over the Catholic Church to try to find out who is a true Christian. And they do this through torture and through the use of inquisitors. And we saw a pretty disturbing video about that. All right, sorry, this has been 20 minutes. It's a little long, but this is the basic idea. and what we covered and ways to remember it. So I will see you tomorrow.